There's a hidden problem that nobody's paying any attention to, but everybody's facing. The problem of getting out of this thing is a dynamic tension between needing to do well enough to increase taste sensitivity so it can drive you out of the pleasure trap, but not have the goal be perfection so much so that when you find out that you can't reach it, you just kick over the table and quit.
I fell from the healthy path I had started on 2 years ago. I kicked over the table and quit. Then I found purpose and strength to get up one more time by doing this documentary series, not just for myself, but for that little girl I saw on the beach that day that I told you about episode 1. Welcome back to I Thrive, rising from the depths of diabetes and obesity. I'm your host, John McMahon. I'm 120 pounds overweight and a type 2 diabetic. I'm on a journey to educate myself, make a plan, and execute a radical lifestyle turnaround. And this documentary is my invitation for you to come along with me. In our last episode, we learned that knowing what to do is not enough. We learned that our modern environment surrounds us with food that triggers a supernormal stimulus to our brains. The problem is, this super stimulating food turns out to be like poison candy handed out to us at Halloween by a food industry that employs a team of scientists to make sure their processed food bangs on the dopamine centers of our brain like an addictive drug. It drives us to literally eat ourselves to death like rats in a cage, and this affects everyone. Most will wear the signs as a deadly fat inside and out. Some may appear slim on the outside and have this deadly poison eating away at their inside, totally unaware. In this episode 6, Beating Your Genes and 3 More Deadly Traps, we're going to find out that food addiction and the pleasure trap are just the beginning of the challenges we face in our struggle to thrive. I'm going to invite you to join me on not so private a session with my psychologist, Dr. Douglas Lyle, co-author of The Pleasure Trap, as he takes us beyond the pleasure trap. All right, so I've got you guys sitting in with me on a consult with Dr. Doug Lyle, who is an esteemed psychologist and a friend, and I'm one person that I go to for counsel and also complete vulnerability to look for the solutions of problems like this big one, diabetes and obesity, and just being able to put this behind me and get on with the best expression of, you know, what I can do. So you guys just listen in, and here we go. And you have my permission to share our discussion, obviously, here on tape. So I'll have you go ahead and just introduce yourself, and then I'll hit you. I'll dump a little on you of where I'm at and what I'm struggling with, even with the production of this documentary.
Sure. I'm Doug Lyle. I'm the psychologist for the True North Health Center and also for the McDougall Wellness Program. And what I do with a large part of my career is to try to help people through a journey like the one that John is trying to go through. And we know that this is not easy. We know there's many traps that are involved here. There's an awful lot that's loaded against you. You were designed as a hunter-gatherer for an environment with a psychology that was designed for an environment where food was scarce, and that the food that was in that environment was of moderate caloric density. And you were designed with a motivational system that said make sure that you go clean out the richest food first. Like wherever the rich food is, try to get there and try to make sure you get at least your share. And with that psychology operating inside you, you now have been put into the 21st century, where we have a completely novel situation evolutionarily, where you are surrounded with food, and you're also surrounded with food that's richer than the richest food of your natural history. So meat would have been typically maybe the richest food that people would have typically gotten into on a recurrent basis at maybe 800 calories a pound, whereas a peanut butter sandwich is 2,000 calories a pound. And so you are designed by nature to seek out that richest possible food. And yet, if we do that, if we follow our instincts in the modern environment, we're going to walk right into trouble. And so that's the troubles that we try to unwind.
Great. So I just want to be candid about what I've been through. So my good friend Larry, he was concerned with my weight.
Yeah.
Not my weight, but just my overall health and everything that was going on. He paid for me to go to True North for a week just to eat.
Yes.
Just to eat clean, whole plant foods with no oil, no salt, no sugar. And so this started my journey a couple of years ago. I did really well.
Yeah.
Like in 6 months, I lost like 50 pounds. I was just feeling amazing.
Yeah.
And then I was in London, and I said, I'm in London. I'm going to a pub, and I'm having fish and chips.
Yeah.
And a cold beer.
Sure.
And a Guinness,
Yeah.
that's what's going to happen. I'm not leaving London. That started in 2016, this downward spiral.
Yeah.
And now I am 20 pounds heavier than what I was when I first went into True North 2 years ago.
Right.
And in dire straits with my health, with
Yes.
my diabetes, with neuropathy, with cardiovascular problems and eye problems, and probably soon I'll start seeing the kidney stuff kick in. And then I go on this journey to share with others, to reverse the pandemic of diabetes and obesity. I interview all these experts, and I'll go from one of these interviews, and sometimes I'll be on a high, sometimes I'll be stressed out, but either way, it seems like I'm looking for something, and man, I'll just be going right through the drive-through, and I'll know, and I'll just go through, and I'll be having that burger or that shake, or I'll be buying that candy bar at the 7-Eleven when I fill up for gas, and knowing, and that just doubles on like, what is wrong with me, you know? And then sometimes though, I've got to say, I took a $30 Uber ride to get to a Whole Foods, which was on the other side of town. I ate a 3-pound salad that cost $30. It was like the $60 or $70, $80, whatever that is, $30, $60, $90 salad to stay on track. So this is what it's been, but I'm on the losing end of that, because I'm not making the progress that I should. Right. And I'm feeling the guilt and the shame, like I'm completely screwed up, and there's no way out of it. And some of the thoughts I did in speaking with some of the other experts, at least they introduced this concept of food addiction, which was new to me. I had no idea that was even possible. Yeah. The idea that other people suffer with this gave me some relief, but I'm still stuck. Sure. So that's kind of where I'm at, and dealing with the guilt and the shame. And I'm thinking, well, maybe I'm just one of this. Someone's got to be the statistic, right? Yeah. I'm not going to make it. Yeah. And maybe if I produce this documentary, it'll help someone else. Yeah. Sure. That's where I'm at. Got it. Yeah, I talked to some of these doctors that I even know, and they're like, "What are you doing? It's got to be 100%. You got to do it. You got one foot in the grave. You can't mess around anymore." Right. And there I am in that bag of peanut M&Ms, and one thing that one of the doctors said really caught me when they were talking about alcohol and chemical addiction. They're talking about they get to the point, the addicts, they're not getting that high anymore. Mm-hmm. They're just taking the drug just to feel normal.
Yeah.
And I instantly resonated with that. I thought, I do that all the time. Just I feel this anxiety, I feel this knot, and Susan had talked about dopamine transmitters down-regulating and getting less and less. And I feel like I get that hit of whatever that food I'm eating, just to feel normal.
Yeah.
So there's everything on the table.
Yes.
And I can't be the only one that goes through this.
You are not. You're not. Well, John, what you've got is you've got actually not just one problem, but there's a few. And that's what makes this difficult. Usually when expert analyses come in and they study disasters, they don't find that one mistake happened. They usually find out that 2 or 3 happened, and it's usually more than 2, it's usually 3. The reason is that people are smart enough to usually anticipate one problem, and they're even smart enough to anticipate a couple of problems. But when you start to get 3 or more factors that are involved in a problem, in a crisis, then that gets harder to keep track of, and it starts to get beyond the normal abilities of people to manage things. So that's how you wind up with the Exxon Valdez, and that's how you wind up with Pearl Harbor. When we go back and we study great tragedies, we find that there are multiple things that are relatively rare that happen, in concert or in a series, and that's what sinks our ship. So in this case, we're going to find that you and many people who are struggling with this problem have several forces that are at work here that we need to get good at managing them one at a time. We sort of need to focus and understand and kind of get up the learning curve on each of these things. And we need to put them together just like someone who's learning how to juggle. You can't juggle 5 starting out. You first got to learn how to juggle 2, and then you get 3, and 3 is a big jump. And then 4, you have to be good to do 4, and then 5 is a superb juggler. And doing well at this is probably about the level of 3 to 4. In other words, it's no joke. You got to be pretty good, and you have to have quite a bit of practice to be able to juggle 3 or juggle 4, okay? You don't have to be like a Dr. Alan Goldhammer who's juggling 5. That's a master, okay? So we don't need to get there to get you well, but we do need to get you focused on a few things. Now, you've learned about some things. So you've learned about what Dr. Goldhammer will call the pleasure trap, which is essentially the addictive nature or the hyperdopamine stimulation of the taste centers as a result of really rich food. So that's enough to sink a whole bunch of ships right there. So we have to know that's there, and you do know that's there. I don't think that's the biggest thing that you're facing now, even though it's big. It's important and it's a big block, but I don't think it's the biggest stumbling block that you have. You have another stumbling block, another part of what we call the pleasure trap, which is energy conservation. So you're designed just like every other creature. We're trying to conserve as much energy as possible because really the nature of life is the nature of the transformation of energy into the DNA molecule. So energy and time are the 2 constraining forces on life, and so therefore it's no surprise that animals the world over are trying to do everything that they can do to conserve energy. When we look at herbivores, what they do is that they seek the richest food in their environment. They always like the grass that's the tastiest, and the grass that's the tastiest is the grass that has the most nutrients. If you're an omnivore, omnivores really prefer the richest food that they can get. They prefer animal food because animal food tends to have higher caloric content. If you're a carnivore, what you prefer is the weak, the sick, the slow, the isolated, and the injured. You actually prefer the animals that are the easiest to take down because you get the most energy back for the least energy out. So throughout the animal kingdom, what we're going to see is a tremendous issue with respect to energy, and you've got that. So that's why you talk about the drive-through. So the drive-through, as soon as McDonald's put in a drive-through in the 1960s, it was doing 70% of their business instantly, which remains true to this day. It's just too much trouble to park the car and walk across the parking lot. just that much energy is enough to get us into trouble. So I know that when people get on this journey, they're not used to putting out the energy that it takes to get to the marketplace, to learn what Chef AJ tells us to cook, to buy the equipment that she recommends, to get our kitchen set up, and to sort of settle into the process and get used to the energy expenditure that it really takes to do this right. I know that that's what you're going to need to do. I know you've been on a mission here to sort of document and understand this problem and make sure that you're going to be going the right direction. I know that you're going to go the right direction now. You've talked to enough people, you know enough about what to do. Now you're going to need to get home and you're going to need to really execute. And that means you're going to get used to spending the energy on this problem and get this thing done so that you've got healthy food in front of you easily. That will help the competition between the healthy food that is not as rich and the drive-through food, which is a few minutes away, and you know that you don't have to do any energy to put it out. So this is why it is we want rich, healthy food in the house. Now, so those are two parts, and we could talk about those all day, and those would be enough. But guess what? We've got a couple more. And the next part is the one that my colleagues are not very aware of. They're vaguely aware of it, but they really don't know how this works. This is truly the land of the psychologist and not the land of the medical doctor. And this is going to be what I call the ego trap. It also goes by other names in psychology today. It's similar to Dr. Carol Dweck's theory called mindset. The problem is that people are motivated to sabotage themselves when we set the bar too high, when we put expectations too high. So if you have a young person who gets an award for being the best poet in their high school, they're in trouble, because what's going to happen now is they go forward in life with the expectation that they're going to do brilliant things, and in fact that expectation is going to cause them to protect themselves from the status or esteem loss that comes from doing their best and then having it not be that special. This essentially self-destructive tendency is literally an adaptive instinct. It's what I call adaptive self-destruction. And I don't believe that there's another creature on earth that has a tendency like this. I think this is one of many things that makes human beings unique, and it makes our pursuit of self-improvement remarkably problematic. It sets in place a barrier that we vaguely know is there, but is absolutely there, and it's a major obstacle to human effort and human achievement. Let me explain why this would have come to be and how ubiquitous this problem is. Think of a young man back on the African savannah 150,000 years ago. He belongs to a tribe, and I want you to picture this young man at 17 years old. He's an average athlete, which means he's a pretty good athlete because they've got very athletic things to do there. So by modern standards, he'd be pretty fancy, but by their standards, he's just average. And he's average attractive, and he's average smart, and he's average funny. He's got an average personality, he's average height, average weight. Everything about this guy is average, which means that we know that he's headed for an average dating career, which means he's going to have an average wife with average children, and this is how it's going to go. So he is designed by nature to try to figure out how to break out of average and to try to do better for himself, particularly in the mating arena. He wants to do more than average, and he wants to do fancier than average. So let's suppose he goes on one of his first hunts, and he's expected to do average work. And he comes across a young wildebeest with its foot stuck in a snake hole. And he takes out a rock and he bludgeons it to death, and then he stands 20 yards away and he throws a spear into it after it's gone. And he drags it home, and they have a big feast, and he tells a big story about how he threw his spear into this thing, when it was going 40 miles an hour, and he got it. And so now there's a big feast, and everybody's all proud of him, and they're all happy about it. And now he's getting winks from girls that are above average. And if he's lucky, he's going to get lucky. And if he's really lucky when he gets lucky, he might actually wind up with a child. that comes as a result of that success. And now that child is going to be above average because the mate was above average. So you can see that he's designed by nature to try to hold on to this newfound esteem, because this newfound esteem is being, essentially he's cashing it in terms of genetic chips. And he's built by nature like a laser beam to figure out how to get this done. And so what's going to happen is when it's time to go on the next big hunt 3 weeks from now, it's in his best interest to figure out how he can't go. This is where he sprains his ankle coming across a rock on the river. This is how it is that somehow he's got a problem with his shoulder because he got into a wrestling match. And it turns out suddenly he's got an injury and nobody can see it, but he can feel it and it's bad. Okay? One way or the other, it's in his best interest to procrastinate and put this off, because if he goes on his next hunt, when he goes on that next hunt, he knows that he's very likely to do average work and then he's back to his average life. And he doesn't want to give that up. So this means that he is designed by nature to try to glide, to try to hold on to this status or this esteem for as long as he can. And the only way to do it is to not try. He needs to find a way to kick over the table and procrastinate. And I will submit that this mechanism, which is I call the ego trap, the ego being the mechanism inside of us that is sensitive to what other people think of us and is actually very worried and scheming to try to optimize our esteem or our status in our village. That mechanism is sensing that there is more to lose than there is to gain by taking an effort. And in his case, he can sniff that he's very unlikely to be lucky twice. And so he's very likely to lose esteem by putting his very best effort forward in the next hunt. So therefore, the right solution is to not try at all and to procrastinate and kick this can down the road. Now, I see this happen constantly. I see this in young people who are students in 7th, 8th, or 9th grade, and they are told by their parents that they're brilliant because they're smart, and that they should be able to get straight A's because they got straight A's once. And now suddenly that child is under a lot of pressure, and they can sense that they're not so brilliant, that they're actually having to study very hard, and that they might have gotten a break in a class or two, and in fact they don't expect themselves to be able to reach that level. And so what we will very often find is you'll find them self-sabotaging. You'll find them finding ways to indicate that they're not trying. Now they're addicted to video games. Now they're screwing up. And now the parents are so frustrated because they watch a child of great promise actually very clearly going the wrong direction, and they're mystified. And they will say things like, just do your best, we don't really care. Whatever you do, just do your best. And what that means to the child is that we're going to expect that when you do whatever you're doing your best, and then if it falls short, you're going to lose status. So that is not a message that works, and it's a message that will cause that child to make it exceedingly clear to their entire social environment that they are not trying. Okay? This is the way that that child can hold on to his or her status, by making sure everybody sees that I'm really doing poorly because I'm clearly not trying. I believe that this is the heart and soul of addiction. I believe that drug addiction, alcohol addiction, etc., although the pleasure trap aspects, the supernormal stimuli that's involved here is very important, and it's a critical aspect to the problem. I believe that the social psychological aspect in the form of the ego trap is equally potent. And I believe that you're a smart guy and you've got a lot to gain by doing this thing right. You know that it's your life at stake. But at the same time, you have a lot of people talking to you telling you, just do it, just do it. Okay, yeah, I know it's hard, but you can do it, just do it. And as you get this, and you get a message also, a message that because of the nature of the pleasure trap and the addictive nature of the modern food supply, you're also getting the message that the right way to do it is to be perfect. The right way to walk away from alcohol is to walk away from it completely. The right way to walk away from heroin or cocaine is to walk away completely. That this is what you must do. Okay? I understand that that's what my colleagues think, and from one particular angle, they're right. But from another particular angle, that's a prescription for disaster. And the other angle is the ego trap. The ego trap and the pleasure trap are literally two different countervailing forces, and you cannot do them both at the same time optimally. You actually have to compromise on each of them in order to make this work. This is like a Chinese finger trap. If you pull too hard too quickly, you're going to remain in the trap. You have to be gentle with yourself, and you have to be understanding of your own nature. You have to understand and appreciate the depths of this mess. And when you do, we set the bar a little lower. We set it for you to do a good job. We set it for you to set up your kitchen and make sure that there's healthy food in it. We make sure that there's nice fresh fruit around so that it's appealing. We have a core for the apple so that every morning you start out and you core an apple or a pear, and it's right there and it's already sliced up, so that you don't actually have to go to the trouble later to slice it up. We want nice healthy food around, nice and convenient, and we want a good routine that we're going to do over and over again. But we're not going to ask you for perfection, so that when you slip and when you stumble, we're not going to consider this a disaster. What we're going to want to aim for is something on the order of 80 to 90%. We want most of the calories that are going in you to be really good calories. If we do this, we recognize that when you slip, you're hurting yourself in terms of the pleasure trap just a little bit. I know this. But the pleasure trap, we don't need to be terrified of it. Okay, this is not heroin. It is not cocaine. This is not crack. This is food. And it's super normal food, and it's magic food, and it's too rich food, and it's very appealing food. But it is not the same thing as heroin. And it is not the same thing as alcohol to an alcoholic. The neuroscientists can show us that it's the same areas of the brain, but it's not the same degree of intensity. It is not. However, it will pull you. It will pull you. It'll constantly, it's going to pull, it's going to tug you, it's going to get you leaning its direction. Okay? And when it does, what we want to do is we want to be as prepared as possible to push back. We need to, try to have better habits. But when we stumble, this is not a crisis, because you don't have to be perfect to get well. You just have to be good. Okay, now, in allowing ourselves some flexibility to understand that this is not crack cocaine and that we do not have to be perfect to get well, what we're going to do is we're going to take this thing down. I want people to imagine that the way they grade their days is like A, B, C, D. And most of the time in this life, in order to get into trouble with your diet and get into trouble with your health, you need to be a C player or a D player. Very few B players get into trouble. Very few B players that are eating a lot of rice, beans, potatoes, oats, corn, fruits, vegetables. If you're eating a lot of that and eating some other stuff, you're probably not in trouble. Okay? But we want to have it, we want to turn people into B players. And then once you're a B player, maybe you become an A player. Maybe you don't. Maybe you just stay a B player. So that's how I try to keep people out of this trap of self-destruction. I believe that most people stay in, for example, an alcohol addiction, not because the alcohol is so tremendous, even though it is. It's a lot tougher than this food. Alcoholism to an alcoholic is really hard, but I'll tell you what's even harder. And that's that people telling them, you're too smart for this, you can do it, just put down the bottle, just do it. When they have tried very hard and they have failed many times, what will happen is they will sniff that they cannot just do it, and they're not sure that they could do it even if they tried their best. And so therefore what they're going to do is they are going to procrastinate, just like our boy in the ancient village, and they are going to put this off, and they're going to say, yes, yes, I know that that's true, and I'm going to get to it. In fact, I'm planning to get to it right after I get this big project done. I'm going to get to it right after this or that happens, right after my daughter's wedding, right after I get the house sold. In fact, I'm going to get to it tomorrow. And then tomorrow, it's that I'm going to get to it tomorrow. So what they do is they do an endless cycle of procrastination in order to put off the day when essentially they're on the line, because we can't judge them because they're not on the line yet, because they're not trying. So I want you to try. It's time to head home. It's time to sort of finish this odyssey. You are smart, you are motivated, you have learned a tremendous amount about what to do. You know, there's still some learning curves to go up. You know, you got some work with the knife and AJ's recipes and Kathy Fisher and Mary McDougall, and there's an awful lot of people out there that have the right solution and can tell you the specifics about what to do. And then you just need to start doing it. But I don't want you to think that you have to do this perfectly. You have to do it well. You have to do it well enough that you still really like the taste of healthy, good food. That's what we need to do. Does that make sense? Okay. There's one more problem, and I'm sorry to tell you. So now we've worked our way through. We have the pleasure trap, which we now know. We have energy conservation, which we're going to have to get control of. And now we have the ego trap, where we realize that this is a very special type of a problem, that addictive problems are not like other problems. If you're trying to be a great writer and someone told you that you were a great writer and they put you in the ego trap, all you have to do is you have to sit down and grind, and you have to face the fact that great things don't come out of you automatically. You have to face the fact that you're going to try really hard and people may see that you're trying and you may see that you're trying and you don't live up to your own expectations. And that's a disappointment and it's frustrating. But you are not in the pleasure trap. You don't have a drug that's drawing you into this mess. So the ego trap is hard, but the ego trap with the pleasure trap is one of the most deadly combinations that you could ever come up with. So between the pleasure trap, the ego trap, and energy conservation, we have three things, and three things make a disaster that people can't figure out, and therefore they don't anticipate. Unfortunately, there's a fourth. The fourth problem is what I call the cram circuit, or the conditioned cram. So let me tell you a little bit about what this is and how it works. And it comes about, my understanding of this comes about from several different pieces, but it comes about from a phone call that I get from hundreds of people a year as I consult with people around the United States and around the world, mostly vegetarians and vegans and very health conscious people that are doing a really good job in terms of going the right direction with their diet, but they're frustrated and puzzled by the fact that even though they seem to eat an awful lot of the right foods, they know they eat some naughty foods that are getting them into trouble, and they're 30 pounds overweight, or they're 20 pounds over their weight, or they're 80 pounds overweight, or they're 100 pounds overweight, or they're 50 pounds overweight. They have a substantial weight problem, but the diet doesn't seem to be that unreasonable. They're not eating copious amounts of chicken and fish and eggs and anything else like this. They're not eating bacon and eggs for breakfast on Sunday morning. These are people that are doing a good job, and the problem is somehow they're overeating. And if they listen to some of us experts, we would say that if you eat the right foods, you're not going to have a problem overeating. But it turns out that somehow some of them are. And this is part of the reason, this is a major part of the reason as to why this happens. This is what I call the conditioned cram. Now, human beings are by nature omnivores. There's three kinds of animals in the animal kingdom, basically. We've got carnivores, omnivores, and herbivores. Each of them has quite a different relationship to the environment. So an herbivore wakes up in the morning and it's surrounded by food. So if you're a koala bear living in an eucalyptus tree in Australia, you wake up in the morning in that tree and all there is food all around you. And you just start chewing. And it's not that exciting, but at least there's no anxiety because there's plenty of food around. And if you're a Thompson's gazelle on the African savanna, you wake up and all you are is surrounded by grass. And it's the very grass that you're going to eat. You're literally laying in your food, and you're making love in your food, and you're raising your kids in your food, and that's all you do is run around on your food. So as you can imagine, you're not super excited about eating, it's just something that you do. That's typically the life of the herbivore. The herbivore is surrounded by food, and the food's not that interesting because the food is very low calorie density. It's just a bunch of plant food. A bunch of grass is probably 100 calories a pound. If you're a carnivore, your relationship to food is completely different. So in this case, what's going to happen is you wake up in the morning and there isn't any food. You can see it moving around the savannah, but you can't get it. And it's going to turn out that you probably haven't eaten in a week. The big cats, no matter how athletic and brilliant they are at hunting, the great cats of Africa will eat about once a week. That means that most of the time when they make a very concerted effort to pick off the weakest, sickest, youngest thing that they can possibly find, they lose anyway. That those things are still good enough to beat the big cat. So it means that when you do eat, you're going to cram. You're going to get every bit you can and you're going to stuff it down that gullet, because pretty soon some other big cat that's bigger than you is going to be coming around and finding that you made a kill, and it's going to intimidate you out of your food. So you better eat, and you better eat aggressively. And if it turns out that you start to feel full, you're going to go right past those mechanisms of satiety, because you may not eat again for another 2 weeks. If you're an omnivore, you're halfway in between. So some minutes or some hours of your life, you look like an herbivore who's just chomping away at something that's not very interesting. And then at other times, when you're running into richer food, animal food in particular, you're getting an awful lot more excited. And so an omnivore should have characteristics of an herbivore, and it should have characteristics of a carnivore. And we are an omnivore. And the evidence from our natural history is clear that meat eating was a major part of human natural history. It isn't a necessary part of our current history, and I believe that we're healthier without it today. But it was a major part of our natural history. These were necessary calories that people needed to get to. And we see some interesting characteristics with respect to human beings as opposed to our close cousins, the chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, etc. And that is that we store fat. We store a lot more fat a lot more easily than they store, which tells us something very interesting. It tells us that human beings went through feast and famine periods. They went through periods where they were getting a lot of food, where they were fine, and then they had other periods where they had to live off their fat stores. Other great apes, largely being effectively vegans or very close to vegans, didn't have this problem. They wake up in the morning surrounded by food, and all they have to do is go get it and spend hours and hours a day chewing. Not humans. Human beings don't spend hours and hours a day chewing. They in fact are an animal that goes after much richer food if they can get it. And when they get it, they would cram it. And when they didn't cram it, they craved it and they were waiting for it and they were looking for it. It's not uncommon for human beings in hunter-gatherer societies to go 3 weeks without any animal food at all. It's also common when they make a kill, they might make a big one. And if you make a big one, you cram. This is going to be what I call the cram instinct or the cram circuit that's sitting inside human nature. And the cram circuit basically says, even if you're full, if there is rich food around, cram it in. When people eat the right foods and they do a good job and they've eaten intelligently all day long, and they've even had an intelligent, Neil Barnard or John McDougall or Colin Campbell approved dinner, and they're actually feeling good. The problem is that in their environment, there very, very well may be rich food. There may be almond butter, peanut butter, Ezekiel bread, Earth Balance. There could be soy ice cream in the freezer, and who knows what else. But there could be avocados with chips, could be a whole sack full of cashews. In fact, what you're going to find is that in most people's cupboards and most people's refrigerators, there's a lot of rich food. In our natural history, the richest plant food that you're ever going to get into repeatedly is going to be 400 or 500 calorie pound starches, rice, beans, potatoes, corn, things like that. But in the modern environment, you have processed or very rich sources of plant food. Nuts by the pound that you could never get in our natural history repeatedly. Nut butters, which don't exist at all. Bread, which didn't exist at all. And so you wind up with crackers, bread, processed food. This stuff is all 1,500 calories a pound or more. It's 2 to 3 times richer than meat, which was the food that our ancestors evolved to cram on. So you can only imagine how motivated the modern human is, even after they're full. If there's rich food around in their environment, They're obeying an instinct that says, if there's any rich food in the environment, go ahead and cram it in. Now, this wouldn't be a problem. It really wouldn't be that much of a problem if we crammed at the frequencies that were consistent with our natural history. Our natural history, we were designed to every now and then we would get lucky and we would be able to cram. And so that's why the normal mechanisms of satiety would be bypassed whenever there would be a bunch of rich food that's suddenly available in abundance, and your job would be to go ahead and cram it in because we may not see it again for a month or two. So go ahead and store a little bit of extra fat on your body because we don't know what's coming over the next few weeks. And so this is a natural instinct, but here's the problem. The problem is that if you cram every day, something fascinating happens. Or if you cram even often, what happens is something that was discovered by Ivan Pavlov more than 100 years ago, Ivan Pavlov. This is the great Russian physiologist who discovered what is the foundation of modern learning theory, which is called classical conditioning. And that is that when you do something over and over again that is repetitive and predictable, that knocks your body out of what we call homeostasis. What your body does is it actually engineers what we're going to call a compensatory response. And it conditions itself to get ready to deliver that compensatory response in order to assist you so that your body is actually gets back to a homeostatic position that's ideal for it. So for example, if you work in a cooler, the first day you go there, you're going to have your parka and your gloves on, and you're going to be cold. But the next day, you're actually going to be a little bit warmer as you enter that cooler, because your nervous system is going to know that it's headed into the cold, and it's going to start to engineer some heat for you already. By the time you've worked there for a month, you're getting warm in your hands, extra warm, just in the parking lot on the way in. This is classical conditioning. This is a conditioned compensatory response. The body's compensating for what we're about to do to it. And it's going to turn out that this is exactly how drug addiction works. So that when you use, let's suppose someone is using heroin. If they use heroin, what will happen is that the body will engineer a compensatory response that will push back against that heroin. And they will meet in the middle after a period of time, and so they neutralize each other. One of the most extraordinary discoveries in psychology was in the 1980s. A learning theorist by the name of Shepard Siegel at McMaster's University pointed out to the world that in fact what is happening in this classical conditioning situation with drug addiction or other things is that if you get used to using heroin in a given situation, then what will happen is if you're tinkering around with a little needle and the little spoon or whatever, and then you are expecting the heroin to come, your compensatory response will rise to meet it. And then if it turns out that you don't have any heroin, that feeling inside the system of the compensatory response is very unpleasant. And Shepard Siegel says that's what we call craving. Craving is a classically conditioned compensatory response of the body's defense against what's coming. Shepard Siegel then went on to show us something else that was an incredible insight. And that was in response to a very dangerous drug like heroin. What will happen is the compensatory response is so good that people will use more and they'll use more. And the response will keep chasing it to try to meet it to neutralize the drug. However, what will happen one day, potentially, is that a person may end up who's used to using that drug in the middle of the night. They may use it in the morning because maybe something happened to change their schedule. And what will happen is they will not actually have the cues in their situation to cause them to think that this is coming, and therefore their compensatory response will not be activated. And if they use that drug without the compensatory response, they will die of an overdose, even though the dose is not higher than anything that they were ever used to. This extraordinary insight was proven by Siegel with rats, that he actually conditioned rats to use a certain amount of heroin in a certain area, and then he moved them to different conditions and gave them exactly the same amount of heroin, and they overdosed. This is a huge lesson to us, about the nature of cravings and how the nature of cravings is largely conditioned. It's not entirely conditioned, but it's largely conditioned. Sometimes people are really hungry. Their blood sugar is low, and their hypothalamus is getting signals that the glycogen stores in their liver are low, and they're legitimately hungry. But sometimes they're not hungry. And in fact, a lot of times they're not hungry. So particularly when people have conditioned a cram circuit, where night after night they've eaten a bunch of rich foods after they're already full, what can happen is that their nervous system can literally become classically conditioned to the fact that they are full. The fact that they are full winds up being the cue that tells them that they're about to eat a lot more food. And so the problem is, the first day when you decide that you are not going to eat a lot more food, you are going to have cravings for more food. And those cravings can be pretty intense. They can be telling you that the right thing to do is to get to that refrigerator or the pantry and eat a bunch of rich food in order to neutralize this craving. And this has been a mystery for those of us in this line of work for decades, that we have not been able to understand why it is that sometimes people will continue to eat a lot of food even after it is that they're full. The food that they're eating, it does not tend to be grapes and carrots. It tends to be the richest food in the environment. And we always just thought that it was the pleasure trap, that it was in fact just the pleasure of that food overriding the pain of distending your stomach. Now we know differently, that in fact what it is that the system itself is anticipating that it's going to get a whole bunch of rich food, and as a result, what's going to happen is it's going to drive a craving system even after you're full. Now here's one last problem. That the first day after you, first day that you decide not to cram, you will have a pretty high conditioned compensatory response that will drive a craving at a pretty high level. But the second day that you decide to not cram, it's going to go higher. That in fact, what's going to happen, John, is that you are going to actually have more intense craving the second day, and more intense cravings the third day, and probably more the fourth day. In fact, your cravings don't start to go down, they go up. This is actually called an extinction burst. And the reason why this exists inside of animals as a critically important learning tool for an animal to have is because if an animal ever got used to a set of conditions where it expected to have some reward, then if it doesn't get the reward, it should fight harder for it. Think about, for example, in a bank, if you had a bank robber come in and they tripped the silent alarm, and the guy left and he was just out the door when the cops arrived, the cops would run outside and start grabbing everybody and throwing them up against the wall to try to get the money. But if it was a half an hour later, the cops wouldn't bother. It's early in the loss where it's most intense. Think about, for example, a bird that lives in some forest, and in that forest there's a big bend in a river. And one day it comes across a bend in that river, and in the mud there's all these chubby little worms. And this guy just scarfs down a whole bunch of these worms, and he's all happy about it. And now it's going to turn out that every day he sort of wanders over there, these worms are there. Sometimes early in the day they're not there, but pretty soon he starts figuring it out through a conditioning process, not consciously, that about 4 o'clock he craves to go over to that area, and there's the worms. And he does this for 100 days. Doesn't matter if he's flirting with some other little birds on the other side of the river. Come about 4 o'clock, he heads over to this area. This is classical conditioning. This is why this system works this way. This is there to save this animal's life, to actually get them to be smart about knowing what rewards go with what conditions. Now I want you to think about the 101st day. 101st day, he goes over there at 4 o'clock and there's no worms. He's pretty upset, and he's scratching around, and he then decides to fly away after half an hour, no worms. The next day comes, and what we're going to find is that he's back, and he scratches around even further, and now his little feet are getting muddier as he scratches and scratches and scratches. The reason why is that nature is telling him these worms are probably very close by. They are somewhere. You just need to work harder to get them. The third day, he's probably going to not only scratch his little feet muddy, but he's going to be burying his beak in the mud too. He's going to continue to work harder for a while until finally he starts to become convinced that all of this effort isn't worth it because the worms are gone. Then he's going to go down into what we call extinction. So the way addiction processes work is first, once you're conditioned, if you start to break the cycle, the craving goes up. And then after it goes up, if you get through that process, the extinction burst, you will start to go into extinction. That is the golden process. We have to beat the extinction burst. Many cigarette smokers never beat the extinction burst. The extinction burst fights them for several days, and all that has to happen is for them to get weak once, and they smoke a cigarette, they reinforce it, and they're right back in the middle, of the learning curve. That's why the hardest part is to actually fight through several days in a row. With the cram circuit, we need to fight this cram circuit. If you fight this cram circuit several days in a row, you will get through the extinction burst where your whole physiology is anticipating that it's going to get a bunch of rich food after dinner. It's going to believe it. It's going to have digestive juices. It's going to feel like craving, and it's going to feel like hunger, but it's not hunger. It's a classically conditioned cram circuit. If we get through that process and get it down to extinction, we're going to have you in a situation where suddenly you're not craving that food, which is going to be a little odd. Suddenly you're going to be eating a lot less calories every day because we're not going to be adding 500 or 700 or 1,000 calories to a cram circuit. And so we will have walked away from this thing and we're not even having any effects, except that what we will see is out there in the future sometime, a week or two later, 3 weeks later, or a month later, we're suddenly going to have a craving for no reason. It doesn't even have to be a cue in the environment. There will be a spike in our craving for this. This is what Pavlov noted more than 100 years ago, and we call it spontaneous recovery. And what this is you can imagine what an ingenious device this is for an animal. That if it was used to getting these worms that were a great source of calories, and then it found out that there weren't any worms anymore, and it almost forgot after 3 weeks that those worms were even there, and it was basically in extinction. But every once in a while, its nervous system would say, you know what? Don't forget about that area of the river where those worms were. You should go back and check once in a while because we don't know what gave rise to those conditions. And those conditions may be back and those worms may be back. This spontaneous recovery is what's going to trap most people trying to come out of addiction. Even if they white knuckle it and they get through the extinction burst, which is the hardest part of the fight, very often somewhere down the road they hit a spontaneous recovery, and that if you can imagine what will happen to that bird if it goes back to that area of the river one day and there's worms. The next day it's going to come back, and it's going to come back the next day after that. And then pretty soon it's a fully conditioned organism again. It didn't need to go through 20 days to be fully conditioned. It needed to go through 3. I want you to think about this because this is very similar. This whole problem that we're facing is very similar to cigarettes. It's a close kin to cigarette addiction. And that is that most cigarette smokers, if they ever successfully quit, they quit on average on the 8th major attempt. When I read that research 10 years ago, I didn't know what they meant by the 8th major attempt. What's a major attempt and what isn't a major attempt? Now I know. It's the 8th major attempt where 8 times they got through the extinction burst. 8 times they got through the week or 2 period where they had very intense cravings, and they got this thing all the way down to extinction. And they might have been in extinction for months. And then one day at some party, somebody was too friendly or too attractive, and they, on New Year's, and they offered him a cigarette, and they said, hey, well, would you like to have a smoke? And our person thought to themselves, I've beat this problem. I haven't had a craving in 17 months. I can do this. And they have themselves a smoke on a spontaneous recovery, and they reinforce it, and they are right back in the middle of the learning curve. And now, on the next day at that time, they aren't down at a 1 or a 2 craving, they're all the way up at about a 7. And the likelihood of you having a cigarette sometime in the next 2 or 3 days is now very high. And if they have a second cigarette in the next 2 or 3 days, now they're even higher in the learning curve. And now it's super likely that they're going to have another cigarette in the next 2 or 3 days, and then they have another cigarette. And now they're back fully conditioned. And now if they're fully conditioned, now they're going to have to go through the extinction burst all over again in order to get out of this mess. So now we see the whole list of problems that we're really looking at with respect to this thing. You should not feel one moment of shame if you're fighting this problem. You shouldn't feel one moment of embarrassment as far as I'm concerned. This is not a simple prescription of one of these fine doctors saying, this is the right food to eat, this is not the right food to eat, John, just make a good choice. No. When we really look at the entire panorama of problems that we're facing, we are facing the neuroadaptive taste sensitivity and the pleasure trap problem. We are facing the problem of supernormal stimuli of the food, simply that the food tastes a lot richer and better and is more biologically valuable as far as our instincts know if it's richer food rather than whole natural food. We are facing the problem that the social environment is unbelievably tuned to try to pull us into this trap. Our friends, our family, our neighbors, our doctor, everybody is telling us the wrong direction, and they want us to join them in the most pleasurable activity possible. We're going to have to go against that, and it's going to be a problem. The energy conservation issues, we're going to have to actually put through a lot more energy than most people are used to putting out, and that we're used to putting out around this problem. We're going to have to go against our instincts to actually get organized and consistently put out energy. Then we have the ego trap. We're going to have to not set the bar too high and kick over the table when it is that we feel like we're falling short of somebody's expectations and we're disappointed in ourselves and we're not sure that we can do it. That's a problem all in its own right. Then we have the problem of the conditioned cram circuit, where in fact we're designed by nature to cram a bunch of rich food if it's available, and we can condition it. And once it's conditioned, we have to fight an extinction burst. And even after we fight an extinction burst, then we have to fight spontaneous recovery. When we start putting all this together, we start finding out that, it looks overwhelming. It looks like when you put this together, it's like the devil himself couldn't have made a more difficult set of traps to put us into this. But when you really look what put us into this, these are all features of a creature that was designed by nature to try to do everything it could to get enough calories in an environment of scarcity. That in fact, that's what all of these things are. It's trying to give the richest food to our friends and family because it would be the most valuable thing to help them survive. It's trying to find the richest food in the environment. It's trying to cram the rich food in even if we're full with the other food in order to make sure that we store a little bit of extra fat against the next possible problems that we might face in the environment. It's everything that you can think of, okay? And now what has happened is only in a bizarre environment, only in really the Western world, and only in the last 50 years, have suddenly we've gone from a creature that was designed to scramble around like half a carnivore, looking for rich food, trying to store it on our bodies, trying to do everything possible to remember where to get it and to cram it when we get our hands on it. Literally all of these features were designed by nature to defend us against an environment of scarcity. All of these features now find themselves facing an environment of utter abundance, where rich foods are the norm. They are abundant, they are cheap, they are everywhere, they are beautifully processed and incredibly consistent, to the point where our memories of what a Snickers bar tastes like and what that Snickers bar tastes like are almost perfect. You put that creature in this environment and we have an almost unsolvable problem unless you do exactly what you have done, which is to go through this step by step and get extremely confident that you know what the fundamentals are so that you can begin with fundamental number one and start taking this thing apart piece by piece and putting yourself back together. I want to share with you a single study that was done just on the pleasure trap itself, just on the taste mechanism and not on any of the other things that I just talked about. And it was done with animals and it was done with rats in 2009. to let you know just how much we're up against and why we should have no shame about how hard this is. What the investigators did was that after raising rats on normal, healthy rat chow, they then let them eat American food for a month. Cheeseburgers, French fries, chocolate shakes, whatever they wanted. They had it in the rat cage and they ate as much as they wanted. As you can imagine, they were starting to get sick, they were starting to get pre-diabetic, they were starting to get overweight, all the problems you would expect of these creatures gorging themselves for a month. Then they did something interesting. They then took all that food out of the cage and they put healthy food back in the cage. And then they wanted to just see what the rats would do. It turned out that the average rat did not eat for 14 days. They were totally on strike, basically. And I like to say that one of these little rats gave a gesture to the experimenters with its right paw. Okay? That basically they said, we're not eating this stuff. We're not going to waste our chewing and we're not going to waste our digestion on food of lower calorie density by far than the other food that we're used to getting. We'll just wait. That is nature. And that's just part of the nature that you're facing. You can do this, others can do it. What you've done here is fabulous. And so all we need to do is get home, roll up your shirt sleeves, get Chef AJ on the video, and cook. Cook, eat, repeat. Do it the next day, do it well, and you know what? You're going to have the life you deserve.
Doug, that was amazing. That was quite an earful.
Well, we've been working on it a long time, and we've had so many good folks that have stumbled and then succeeded, and so we've learned sort of one patient at a time, and I think we got some good tools for you, and I think that it's time to get busy.
Is it worth spending 5 minutes on your short version of the motivational triad?
Maybe so. People sort of heard this and they've been hearing it from probably multiple sources and they didn't even quite know what they were hearing. But we see animal nature as basically having three primary motivating forces, and that includes people too. And that is pleasure seeking, pain avoidance, and energy conservation. And those three principles are pretty simple when you really get down to it. And that is that there's certain things that feel really good, that are really good to move towards and to interact with. There's things that are really bad and really dangerous that can do you damage. We got to avoid those. And then what we have to do is not just approach the good things and avoid the bad things, but be really efficient at it, because we want as much of the good things as we can have for as little risk of the bad. So those three principles sort of stand as the basic architecture of why it is that any creature does anything that they do. And so behind this pleasure trap is the story of how the modern food is now super rich, or drugs is the ultimate, but the modern food supply has become drug-like, and it is a super normal, super pleasurable, rich experience. And as a result, it's drawing people towards it. The pain avoidance part of this problem is that people there's other things that are similar to pain and pleasure that we're going to call emotion. They're kinship, they're the psychological equivalent of pleasure and pain. Happiness and unhappiness, and various versions of those things. And one of the things that makes us happy, or is pleasurable effectively, is having other people around us happy with us. And something that is painful to us, we call it psychologically painful, it's the term that we would use, is to be rejected and to be at odds or in a conflictual relationship with other people. And so the second part of the pleasure trap is that our pain avoidance strategies, a big part of that, is to make sure that we don't upset other people, that we stay in a very good, warm situation with them. And as we move away from the pleasure trap with food, we are moving right into conflicted, painful relationships with other people. Very often people close to us, or even people that are acquaintances or coworkers, they're going to be disturbed by what it is that we're doing because we are essentially voting no to their food and their way of life in this arena. And this is one of the most important social processes that there is, as we can see. And so when we make that change and break away, it's painful for us. And there's pretty powerful social instincts saying, don't do it. Just get along with other people. And we have to learn to get along with them without going along with what it is that they're doing. The third part of the triad is energy conservation. And so this requires energy. We've got to put energy into this system and learn some new things and do things in a new way and do things in a way that is probably going to take more energy than the old way. Our instincts are going to fight us on that. But we have to know that we must do this in order to get where it is that we need to go. We can go against our instincts. We can do that. That's what birth control is. Birth control is absolutely flat out going against your instincts. The many things that we do, we can successfully go against instincts. When someone really wants to yell and scream and tell their boss where to go, or get in a fight, or smash their car into the other guy who just stole your parking lot, your parking place, these are all instincts that we can override, and it's possible for us to do so. And we can override the instincts that we're facing with respect to these traps. Not an easy thing to do, as you know. You've known a lot for a while now. You've had some successes. You've sort of gone forward and gone back and gone forward and gone back. This is not an atypical pattern for people fighting an instinct, where the instincts come back and get the upper hand. And then we have to go back and try to get the upper hand over them, and then they're going to come back and try to get the upper hand over us. And so this has been, you've been in an oscillating situation here the last couple of years. You now know, and the docs that you've been talking to now know, I mean, you're still alert, you're still smart, you're still moving around, you still got a lot of life in you. But what's scary is that now the trap is pulling you in. You know what I'm saying? You're starting to get down inside the trap. It's kind of like getting into quicksand. It's like, you don't want to get too far down, and then you cannot get out. And so you can get out. You can get out of this. But we're kind of right now knee deep in the quicksand. And it's time to take it very seriously as you're doing. And now get home, get out the cookbooks, get down to the store, buy some really healthy food, put this together and do a very good job, even if it's not a perfect job. Do a really good job so that you can really get going the right direction.
Great. I just want to step through some of my things in the 4 areas that I resonated with.
Yeah.
So in conservation, I noticed this at work, even in concert with the pleasure trap. So as this started to become more in my awareness, I noticed that I'll feel that craving, right? That I want to eat more, even though I'm not hungry, right? That's the cram circuit, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of this I noticed that's associated with me getting in my vehicle. It was very interesting. And it started to dawn on me, well, of course, as soon as I get into my vehicle, the vehicle's associated with going through drive-through, stopping to get gas, going in the mini market and getting a candy bar or soda, getting in my car, going out to a restaurant to eat. My car is this common denominator.
Yes.
around me eating when I'm not hungry.
Yes.
And then I watched myself. This was at work late at night. It was after some interview. This is just in the last couple of weeks. And boom, there goes this drive-through of this place that I really like, right? And I watched myself do this cost analysis of, well, how much energy is it going to take me? I'm on my way. It's on the opposite side of the road. How complicated is that intersection? How far do I got to go to turn around? It wasn't worth it. And I kept going.
Yes.
And I had just sat there and I laughed. I thought, if that would have just been there, and the thing would have been in and out, I would have been there, wouldn't even thought about it.
Yes.
I would have gone right through the drive-through.
Absolutely. This is really good because you're starting to get an insight as to just how sort of what a quantum computer this brain is. It's like it could flip around, it can be right on the line where you have really good intentions versus the pleasure trap, and just a little feature here can tip the scale, which is why it is that we want to have, really good routines, because in routine you get more efficient. Okay, so as you get these routines in your home that are good, then it's more likely that you're going to do them the next day.
And if I make it just a little bit harder with those routines, or if it's just a little bit farther away, if it's not in my house, or I figure out this car thing, it wouldn't take much. Right. I could get it to where I could battle it on my own, where it wouldn't just, this is where you're going. And I watch myself go along for the ride like, someone's in my own body.
That's right. This is what we've found now looking at cigarette smoking. That is, we had half the country addicted 40 years ago. And I can remember when the laws came in that you couldn't smoke in buildings. First it was public buildings, like the courthouse. And then after that it was all buildings. I'm not sure that's true in all states, but it's true in California. And I can remember a lot of the complaining about this, and complaining from legal scholars, and saying, wait, why should we have these rules? But an interesting thing happened, and that is that we went from a population with 50% of people smoking down to about 18. Now that's interesting. This thing that the Surgeon General has said is the most addictive thing, which is of course ridiculous. All these things have very similar potency until we get into the hardcore drugs, which are worse. But cigarettes, food, salt, what do you call it? Sugar, all these things are not dissimilar. Caffeine is the other thing I was thinking of. Caffeine, cigarettes, they're close.
Refined flours.
Sugars. Yeah, these are all pretty similar players. They're all super normal, but they're not wacko like morphine or crack cocaine or methamphetamine. But those things are unbelievable mountains to try to climb and get yourself past. But these things right here, these things are just tough enough that, but the interesting thing is that when we made them, the people actually had to go down 8 floors, and then they had to walk outside and stand out with the other smokers in the cold and the rain, and then get back in and then go back. It's like it wasn't worth the trouble.
Conservation of energy.
Conservation of energy principle. And this allowed people to slowly work their way through the extinction burst on occasion. So they might finally, 1 week, they just started to not do it. They got through a little extinction burst. They got through, and then they got into extinction. And it wasn't that bad. And then the energy conservation program kept them there, and they're fine.
And that little burst, what's the little burst?
Extinction burst.
No, at the end.
Spontaneous recovery.
Spontaneous recovery might have hit at a time when they were really busy. They didn't have time to go. Their boss, they were in a meeting, and they lived through it. And that last craving went away.
That's right. And actually Pavlov found that the spontaneous recoveries, if they were not reinforced, they become subsequently smaller. So they'll go a while, then they'll still be there, but they're getting smaller and smaller. That's why, you and I have met people that were alcoholics and that fought their way through this, and that they haven't had a drink in 18 years. Now, they haven't been white-knuckling it for 18 years. They white-knuckled it for a year. You know what I'm saying? They had a very hard few weeks as they got through the initial parts. They had many spontaneous recoveries that shook their world. In other words, this is really hard. This is now, alcohol is essentially, if you are an alcoholic, it's approaching the same magnitude of the really hardcore drugs. It can be extremely difficult. And, but if you meet one 18 years later, they're fine. They're not having any cravings. They're not particularly tempted, and they could stand right there and you could pour a glass of wine in front of them. I mean, it's not a cool thing to do, but you might do it and not know it. And they're not going to be tested because they are in a very quiet, long extinction, and it's been a long time since they've had any substantial spontaneous recovery. And once they won the hardest battles, the subsequent battles are easy. And that's what I want to tell you. And that is that it's not fair, but it's just the way it is, that the hardest battles are early. Okay? We got to put our shoulder to the wheel and work really hard at the early battles. If we get our way through the early battles, once you get through the early battles, the other battles are easier. Had you known a couple years ago when you were in London, John?
That was a spontaneous recovery. I just needed to not just know.
You forgot how hard this trap was.
Fish and chips.
We just got to you've already done it once, you can do it again. Just like a smoker will do it 8 times, you can do this a second time.
I ate those chips and it was like the next day, I was still 60 pounds lighter than I was 6 months ago. I felt fine. I thought it was no big deal. And then it just was this.
There you go. And it pulls you back in. So like they say in the Godfather movies, just when you thought you were out, they pull you back in. That's what this is like. And so we got to respect our own biology. That is these elegant and unbelievable designs that are actually pulling us into a trap when they think they're helping us. And that's the problem.
The pleasure trap, I noticed. I used to really love to watch the Food Network, and there's been in the last 20 years an explosion of whole networks that are just talking about food, and and it's so social and it's fun, and you're going out to your friends and barbecue, and we're sitting here in the wine country, and it's just a life can revolve around food and this pleasure. Oh, I want to try this restaurant, and then I'll go here and go there, and you got all of this stimulus, and to change that is just this dramatic withdrawal from that whole culture.
Yes, and and people on the outside don't have any intuition about what it's like on the inside once you've done it. In other words, they can't imagine how good healthy food feels and how good healthy food tastes. It is not the same level of intensity. It is a different life. It's like listening to music at the right level instead of having it blast your ears. It's there's nothing like going to a rock concert and losing your hearing. You know what I mean? I mean, kids are it's stupid and it's a problem, but you can understand why. But in the same way, what you want to do is you want to have this food in a natural balance to you. That way it's sustainable for your health. It's not meant to be boring or bland. It only feels boring or bland after you've trapped yourself. In the same way that people that are having a life and they're smoking cigarettes, they kind of can't imagine not smoking because it feels like it's boring, and they're going to have these cravings, and they feel like it helps calm them down, and they've got all these reasons. But the truth is, if they ever walk away and they ever get away, it's like, this is better. It's a better life. Once in a while, do they get a craving? Sure they do. You better believe they do. So once in a blue moon, there'll be a fairly good spontaneous recovery will come back. The cigarette addicts that I've worked with, sometimes it's in their sleep. So they'll wake up spontaneously in a cold sweat, dreaming that they were smoking again and really enjoying it. So this little trap won't just leave you alone. It's bubbling under the surface, but in their day-to-day life, if you ask them, are like, of course not. I'm not going to go back to that. Smelling bad, coughing, not having, waking up in the morning, having congestion, all these penalties that are associated with this, and now they're in a healthy state and things feel better. That's exactly the way it is with healthy food. Healthy food tastes good, is good, feels good, you feel good. You could get there. Do we lose the rock concert at 120 decibels? Yeah, we do. Do we lose the cool feeling of being in withdrawal and then taking a drag on a cigarette and having that go down, the relief that comes? Yeah, we do. We're going to leave some experiences behind, and we're going to open up a world where things are in much better, healthy, natural balance, and you just have a better life.
Yeah, and just to build on that, what I'm going to leave behind too is the unhealthiness. I'm going to leave behind being 100 pounds overweight. I'm going to leave behind, losing my eyesight and having a heart attack and not being able to feel my feet and looking at a terrible, debilitating, Alzheimer's and just a horrible next 10, 20 years.
Hey,
if that.
You're too much fun. We need you around.
So, it's starting to make that association between all of those bad things and that moment of that pleasure.
Yeah.
because the effects of these take 10 or 20 years to hit.
Yes.
And to realize, wow, what I'm putting in my mouth, it's caused all of this.
The great defensive back, Deion Sanders, was known to be this incredible natural athlete. And because when he, in training camp and in training, he wouldn't work out. He would just goof around. And the other athletes were just in awe of him, because whenever there was any test of ability, he would just blow everybody away. And it turned out that this whole thing was a secret. It was a ruse. And what he was doing, and it was known only to upper management, and it was apparently a well-kept secret, that he would actually go home and work out ferociously. And so he wanted to have this aura around the league that he was so much better than you that it wasn't even worth trying. And that's just part of these interesting stories of humans and how cleverly they can work. They work what I call esteem dynamics.
Yeah.
And that when we get them working in the wrong direction, like the ego trap, they're working against us. And it really is the graveyard of lost potential.
Yeah, okay, now I get it. The other side of that ego trap would be like if that ancient hunter in his spare time went off on his own, if he couldn't go on the hunt or something, and just started practicing like mad, like 10 hours a day to get good enough as what he had already presented himself. Okay. Got it. And the cram circuit. Okay, so when we're talking about these moments, and now that now that I'm aware of it, I can sometimes be aware that I'm right in the middle of this right now.
Yes.
Or the circuit that hits later on.
Yes.
What's the one that hits after 10 or 11 days or?
Oh, the spontaneous.
The spontaneous recovery.
Yes.
If I can be aware, oh, hey, wait a minute, just to be aware of that. Now I can use my limited amount of willpower and all of the tools that I have to say, now this is the time when I need A.
Yes.
Right. This is. I can let everything else go right now for the moment. Whatever I'm doing right now is a time for my 100% focus, all my energy. This is it. I don't cross over this line.
Yes.
At this time. And I can hold my breath for that long, and then it'll pass.
Yes. Beautiful.
That's the time to do that, right?
It's gonna pass. You bet.
That's when I need an A. I don't need an A all the time.
No, but that's when you need an A. You need an A right then, because the system's conditioning process is expecting you to fail. It's expecting you to do what it wants you to do. And if you frustrate it, it's going to get a little tougher on you, but then it's going to pass. And when it passes, this is a critical learning moment for the unconscious, because the unconscious mind now starts realizing, well, maybe we're not going to have that happen. And so it starts to break apart the conditioning paradigm as you start to head to extinction. Life is going to get easier when we get over those. And those moments they're interesting for people to watch and to watch them rise up. They're not intense. This isn't heroin withdrawal, but it's nagging. It's a nagging little chirping, and it's just trying to tug you.
And a habit.
Yes, and it's just trying to pull you in, and it's going to justify it all over the place. And if it could just lure you in, it thinks it did the right thing, which is that it wanted you to swallow 500 extra rich calories. And if we resist that repeatedly, night after night, you know what I mean, we string together 10, 15 nights, this thing starts to figure out that I don't think it's going to happen. And now life just got a lot easier.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I just need to be in jail for like 2 weeks.
Just need to be in jail. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Doug.
My pleasure.
Now I hope you understand the mountain that we are up against and how we must arm ourselves with the right information and take right action immediately. One question I'd like to get to the bottom of that is outside the scope of this documentary series: could it be possible that not knowingly or with malicious intent, by design or just coincidental opportunity, that there is a collusion between some in the food industry, the government, conventional medicine, and the pharmaceutical industry to keep us addicted, sick, dumb, poor, and dependent? If there was such a collusion, it would not be surprising, given the literally trillions of dollars at stake, I'm inclined to believe there is such a collusion, given what Dr. Robert Lustig told us about there being 56 given names to sugar by the food industry to hide and bury the true overwhelming level of its concentration in their processed food, and furthermore, the government giving them an unenforceable standing mandate not to do that, and finally striking down a piece of legislation that would have required it. If that wasn't bad enough, to add insult to injury, we have a $1.7 trillion pharmaceutical industry with the resources that would exceed most nation states, completely ignore the cure and reversal of diabetes and obesity, and instead sell us drugs to manage our disease until we die. In any case, the fact remains that this perfect storm of death by processed food and prescription drugs exists today. It surrounds us, and it's the source of our decline in health, that we're seeing an entire generation die younger than their parents right before our eyes. It's time to take our health care back from the industry and back into our own hands. Do not leave it in the hands of your doctor, the government, the food industry, and certainly don't trust the constant stream of pharmaceutical company commercials you see on TV. Like Dr. Furman says, become an expert. Make a full commitment to do this. Know what you're getting into. Know the reasons why you're doing it. Understand the science behind it. Then when you go do it, go for it. Do it fully and be prepared for it to be tough at the beginning, but it gets easier, just like when you quit smoking. I invite you to join our movement, to take our health and vitality back. When you support this cause by owning the complete series, you can reference it at your own leisure to inform your own plan to wellness, or share it with a loved one to help them inform their own plan to escape the pleasure trap of food addiction and thrive. Your support allows us to stay on top of the research and spread our findings for free, just like we're able to do right now, and sponsor research of our own. Also, a portion of the proceeds gets donated to charities that are helping people every day prevent and reverse diabetes and its complications, and find relief from their pain and suffering. Coming up in episode 7, we uncover environmental factors outside of just food that can contribute to our diabetes and obesity. Moms are going to find out what else they can do now to protect their generations of children. We also discover how to protect from 3 hidden toxins that have spread across the globe, and the detox mechanisms we need to be aware of that keep us clean inside. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next episode.